The fifth time the sheriff's cruiser rolled up my gravel driveway, I didn't even bother standing up. I just sipped my tea and waited. 2 deputies stepped out, one with his hand already resting on his holster, eyes scanning the quiet woods around my lake cabin like I was running a meth lab. This time, the emergency was the color of my front porch. Lavender. Soft, gentle, peaceful lavender, exactly the shade my late husband used to plant around our old garden before cancer took him. I'd painted the porch in his memory. Apparently, that was enough to summon law enforcement. Across the road I spotted her. Jerry Monroe, president of the Timberpine Lake HOA. Standing with arms crossed, sunglasses on, lips curled in satisfaction. Behind her, 3 HOA board members filmed everything on their phones like I was about to be tackled and cuffed. She thought she'd won. That this final humiliation would break me. But what Jerry didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just some grieving widow looking to retire quietly by the lake. I'd spent 30 years teaching inner-city high school kids how to fight for their voices through art and justice. I'd stared down school boards, landlords, and bureaucrats with better suits and sharper knives than her. And this little HOA war? She just made it personal. Let them send cops. Let them stack fake violations to the sky. I had something they didn't. Patience. Records. And the law. By the time I was done, Jerry wouldn't just regret crossing me, she'd wish she never stepped foot near my lavender porch. If you think Evelyn was right to stand her ground, comment 1 below. It had been 3 months since I moved into the old cabin on the north side of Timberpine Lake. I'd found the listing by accident while scrolling through properties late one night, half awake and too heartbroken to sleep. After Greg died, I couldn't breathe in our old house anymore. Every drawer, every photo frame, every unopened jar of his favorite marmalade just hovered. I needed space. Trees. Water. Silence. The cabin was modest, just 2 bedrooms, a creaky dock, and a porch that sagged slightly, but the moment I saw it, something inside me settled. It felt like a place where healing could happen. The porch had been a faded beige, chipped from years of weather. On my 3rd day, I drove into town, bought a gallon of lavender paint, and spent the weekend giving that old wood a new soul. It was the same shade as the lavender Greg used to plant every spring along our white picket fence. He said the smell kept his mind calm, like pressing pause on the world. I was halfway through the final coat when I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. "I'm afraid that color hasn't been approved," came a voice as brittle as dry pine needles. I turned slowly. She looked like money dressed in casual power. Perfectly pressed button-down, pearl earrings, and the kind of haircut that costs triple digits every 6 weeks. Her name tag, yes, she wore one, read, Jerry Monroe, HOA President. "Excuse me?" I said, brush still in hand. Jerry stepped closer, holding a leather-bound binder like a weapon. "Timberpine Lake Community Association has strict architectural standards. All exterior color changes must be submitted for review and approval. Lavender is not on the approved palette." I wiped my hands on a rag. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but my cabin isn't within your HOA boundary." I checked. Thoroughly. She offered a tight, practiced smile. "Property lines are fluid around here. While you may not be technically included, we expect everyone to follow community guidelines. It preserves harmony." "I read the property line," I said, stepping off the ladder. "I'm not yours." Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes narrowed like she'd tasted something sour. "Well," she said, handing me a pamphlet thick as a novel, "I encourage you to review this. Page 43 lists acceptable paint colors. We'll be expecting your compliance." She pivoted with military precision and walked off my property as if it still belonged to her. That evening, I sat on the porch steps watching the water shift in the breeze when someone called from across the lane. "Don't mind her," the woman said, approaching with a friendly wave. She looked to be in her late 30s, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt that read, "Plant trees, not tyranny." "Talia Jong," she said, offering a hand. "I live 2 cabins down." Evelyn Rhodes, I replied, grateful for a kind face. She's been HOA president for 15 years, Talia said, nodding toward where Jerry had vanished. Practically runs the town. If your mailbox is half an inch too tall, she'll fine you. If your wind chimes are too musical, she'll send a warning. I'm not even part of the HOA, I said. Talia gave a half smile. That won't stop her. You're a loose end. And Jerry hates loose ends. I looked out at the calm lake again. So much for peace and quiet. The first notice came 3 days after the paint dried. A folded paper taped to my screen door, printed in bold Arial font like it had been mass-produced for HOA warfare. Violation, unauthorized color modification. Action required. Repaint to a neutral shade within 7 days or face incremental fines. I laughed. Honestly laughed. It was so ridiculous, so petty, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. I wasn't part of the HOA. The boundaries were clear. But the notices kept coming, one every other day like clockwork. Violation, unapproved wind chimes, auditory nuisance. Violation, non-compliant trash receptacle, color, slate blue versus HOA-approved charcoal gray. Violation, garden decor exceeding height restrictions, lavender pots equals 24 inch above ground. I began pinning them to the inside of my pantry door like a trophy wall. But the humor wore off quickly. Each one came with thinly veiled threats of legal action. One evening, I found a man photographing my porch from across the road. When I stepped outside and asked if he needed help, he scurried away like a raccoon caught in a trash can. The next morning, a sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway. Sheriff Clay Dobbins was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a weathered face and permanent sunburn lines across his neck. He stepped out of the car looking sheepish. Ms. Rhodes, he said, holding his hat in both hands, I'm here because we received a complaint about unpermitted exterior modifications. You mean my purple porch? I asked flatly. He sighed. I figured it might be something like that. Do you have any documentation about your property's status? I handed him the property line survey from my closing paperwork. He studied it for a moment, then nodded. Well, he said, glancing toward the road where Jerry's Cadillac SUV sat parked, this shows clearly that you're outside the Timberpine Lake HOA jurisdiction. He handed it back. You're in the clear, ma'am. Sorry for the trouble. I watched from my porch as he walked over to Jerry, who was standing on the far edge of her lawn, arms folded, lips pursed. She gestured animatedly as he spoke. Whatever she was saying, he didn't seem impressed. After a few minutes, he tipped his hat and drove off without another word. I thought that might be the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, I received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was a letter on crisp ivory paper, embossed with the logo of Elkins Law Group. It was signed by Mark Elkins, ESQ, and it accused me of willful noncompliance with established community guidelines, causing property value degradation, and creating a hostile aesthetic environment. It demanded immediate corrective action, or legal proceedings would begin. Mark Elkins. I'd heard the name. He was Jerry Monroe's nephew. Fresh out of law school 10 years ago and already known for being litigious, arrogant, and eager to please Aunt Jerry. I sat down at the small kitchen table, hands shaking, not from fear, but fury. I hadn't retired here to fight with power-hungry neighbors. But I also hadn't retired here to be bullied into submission. That evening, I walked down to the cabin at the end of the lane. Edwin and Marie Simmons had lived on Timberpine Lake for over 40 years. Greg and I had actually rented their cabin one summer when we were younger. Marie opened the door before I knocked. You've met Jerry, I see, she said dryly. She sent me a legal threat, I replied. Marie stepped aside and poured me a glass of sweet tea while Edwin grabbed a fat manila folder from the bookshelf. She did the same thing to the Clarks before they sold, Edwin said. Sent violation letters every week for 6 months until they gave up. But they were in the HOA. You're not, Marie added, and that changes everything. Edwin tapped the folder. We've been keeping records. Photos. Letters. Notes. Everything she's done since taking power. You should do the same. That night, I started my own binder. Tabs. Dates. Photos. Audio notes. Everything. If Jerry wanted a fight, she was going to learn the hard way that widows can be a whole lot tougher than they look. By the end of that week, my binder was already half full. Photos of every notice. Screenshots of every email. Voice memos detailing interactions, times, weather conditions, even my own emotional state. I wasn't just collecting information. I was building a case. But something kept tugging at me. If I wasn't in the HOA, legally on paper, why did Jerry and her nephew feel so confident? Why the threats? Why the lawyer? Surely they knew they didn't have a leg to stand on, unless they'd found a way to move the ground beneath me. I decided to find out. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office in Millersfield, about 45 minutes of winding backroads and spring pollen. The building was a 1970s concrete box, ugly as sin but filled with answers. I wasn't sure what I was even looking for, but something in my gut said start with the maps. The zoning clerk, a tired-looking man named Reggie, was surprisingly helpful. When I explained my concern, he pulled the Timberpine Lake property plat from the archive room and rolled it out on a long table. This is the official map filed with the county when the HOA was incorporated in 1996, he said, pointing to the inked boundary lines. My cabin sat clearly outside the shaded HOA zone. But then he paused. That's odd, he muttered, flipping open a newer digital map on his monitor. The screen showed a slightly different boundary. My property was inside this version. I leaned in. Who updated this? He squinted at the metadata. Looks like a revision submitted 4 months ago, by Elkins Law Group, on behalf of Timberpine Lake HOA. There it was. They'd submitted a correction to the digital zoning overlay. Nothing legally binding, but enough to confuse people, especially people who didn't know how to read plats or check physical archives. I photographed both maps. Printed copies. Scanned them to a USB. My binder was growing teeth. As I walked out of the clerk's office, someone called my name. I turned to find Talia John standing beside her hybrid SUV, holding a stack of folders. Didn't expect to see you here, she said with a grin. Just digging through lies, I said. She laughed. Welcome to Timberpine. We grabbed coffee at the cafe next door, and Talia revealed something I hadn't heard before. You know the lake's protected, right? I blinked. Protected how? She pulled out a document. Timberpine Lake and the surrounding forests were designated a Category 2 state conservation zone back in 1971. It's technically a recognized ecological habitat. That's why you can't build high-rises, pave over shoreline, or do anything that alters the watershed without a special permit. My heart jumped. Does the HOA know that? They pretend not to. But trust me, they do. The whole push to standardize repairs and repaint cabins is about preparing for development. If they get full control of the lakefront, they can start applying for exemptions and carve loopholes. It's happened before. We exchanged numbers. That night, I dug deeper into county land use history, conservation laws, and eventually, something that stopped me cold. The Wisconsin Area Freedom Act of 1983. I found it buried in a state legislative archive, but the language was crystal clear. No homeowners association may impose architectural or aesthetic regulations upon properties not explicitly included in their original charter boundary filings at the time of enforcement. Attempts to do so are considered coercive and legally actionable. There it was. Not just a defense. A weapon. The next morning, I drove straight to Edwin and Marie's cabin. We called the other 2 property owners outside the HOA line, Samir and Lena, a young couple who inherited their grandfather's cabin, and Dr. Howard Kaplan, a retired veterinarian who lived part-time on the lake's far edge. We met on Edwin's screen-in porch under the shade of a pine tree that had stood for nearly a century. I'm calling us the Timberpine 5, I said, holding up my binder. We've got law on our side. We've got documentation. And we've got each other. Samir raised an eyebrow. You're saying we fight back? I'm saying we stop hiding. And we stop being picked off one by one. Talia joined us that afternoon, bringing a laptop full of environmental codes and a portable scanner. We started comparing notes, compiling every violation, every letter, every visit from the sheriff. For the first time since I moved in, I didn't feel isolated. I felt dangerous. And I could tell Jerry Monroe was about to feel the same. Should HOAs be allowed to control non-members? Yes or no? The storm rolled in without warning, thunder like cannon fire and winds that howled through Timberpine like the ghosts of every tree ever felled. Rain pounded the lake for 6 straight hours. By morning, the shoreline was littered with broken branches, overturned kayaks, and half the neighborhood's patio furniture. My cabin had taken a hit too. The roof over the living room had peeled back like a sardine lid, and water had soaked the sofa and floorboards below. It wasn't catastrophic, but it needed immediate attention. I didn't wait. Greg had taught me how to shingle when we renovated our house back in 2004. With gloves, a nail gun, and a little help from Marie and Edwin's grandson, I was up on the roof within 48 hours, securing a tarp, stripping damaged wood, and prepping the slope for new shingles. That's when Jerry made her move. On day 3 of repairs, a clipboard-wielding man I didn't recognize showed up in my yard wearing a vest that read, HOA Disaster Recovery Authority. Excuse me, he said, gesturing toward the roof. All post-storm exterior work must be approved and performed under HOA supervision. Emergency Ordinance. Section 9A. I blinked. I'm not in the HOA. He handed me a packet. During a declared emergency, Timberpine Lake HOA has been granted temporary oversight of all lake-adjacent properties for the purpose of maintaining community safety and aesthetic continuity. By who? I asked, skimming the vague legalese. The County Emergency Management Office, he replied. Signed off yesterday. Sure enough, there was a flimsy stamp at the bottom of the last page. It looked like it had been rushed through with about as much scrutiny as a parking permit. I called the county office that afternoon. A frazzled woman answered. Oh, that? Yeah, someone from Timberpine submitted a packet requesting temporary authority during recovery. Said they had the structure in place to coordinate repairs better than the township. I almost laughed. Jerry had exploited the chaos, presented herself as the solution, and claimed dominion over properties that weren't even under her jurisdiction. The next day, a sheriff's deputy hand-delivered a court summons to my door. The HOA was suing me. Allegation: violation of Emergency Structural Compliance Ordinance. Relief sought: immediate injunction, $2,500 fine, HOA supervised restoration. It was signed by Mark Elkins. The arrogance practically bled off the page. I stared at the paperwork for a long time before finally exhaling. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. But the precision of it, the legal maneuvering, the strategic timing, the fabricated emergency jurisdiction, it was almost impressive in a twisted way. They wanted to scare me. To isolate me. But they didn't know I'd already found the cracks in their foundation. That night, just as the sun was setting over the still choppy lake, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. No caller ID. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call came in. And a third. I picked up on the 4th ring. A hushed voice came through. Female. Nervous. Ms. Rhodes? Yes? I'm on the HOA board. I can't say who. But you need to know, Jerry and Mark altered the boundary map before they submitted the emergency ordinance. They moved the line digitally to make it look like your cabin was inside. It's not. You were right all along. My heart skipped. Can you prove that? I asked. I think so. There's an earlier draft. I saw it. I don't know what they did to the files, but it wasn't legal. Why are you telling me this? A pause. Then, because this isn't about community safety. It's about money. And control. She's lost it, Ms. Rhodes. She'll take down the whole neighborhood just to win. The line went dead. I sat there in the silence, the storm outside long gone, but a bigger one now brewing inside that binder of mine. They had forged documents. They had abused emergency powers. And now, I had a witness. Whatever fear I'd carried was gone. I wasn't just going to win. I was going to burn their little paper empire to the ground, with nothing more than facts, records, and the truth. The courthouse in Millersfield was buzzing the morning of the hearing. Timberpine Lake residents packed the rows, some whispering nervously, others clearly there for the spectacle. Even Sheriff Dobbins showed up in plain clothes, standing along the back wall with arms crossed and a grim look on his face. I sat alone at the defendant's table, a binder thick with evidence beside me, a folder of printed maps, state laws, and statements neatly organized. I wore Greg's old corduroy blazer for luck. It was a little big, but it made me feel steady. Across the aisle, Mark Elkin smirked at me from behind his polished walnut briefcase, flanked by 2 paralegals and a tablet-tapping assistant. Jerry Monroe sat next to him in a tailored gray pantsuit, lips pinched like she'd tasted sour milk. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Rowena Hallberg, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense presence, entered the courtroom. "We're here today on case number 22-9137. Timberpine Lake HOA vs. Evelyn Rhodes," she announced. "Plaintiff seeks injunctive relief under emergency repair jurisdiction. Defendant has filed a countersuit citing overreach, fraud, and boundary manipulation." Mark stood with the confidence of someone used to being the most expensive suit in the room. "Your Honor, the defendant has consistently violated HOA safety protocols and construction guidelines during a declared emergency. The ordinance was approved by county authority." "Objection," I said, standing. "I'd like to question the validity of that ordinance and the documentation used to obtain it." Judge Hallberg raised an eyebrow. "You're representing yourself, Ms. Rhodes?" "I am." She nodded. "Proceed." I walked to the center of the room, every eye on me, and placed 2 maps on the evidence table, one official paper plat from 1996, the other a digitally edited version submitted with the emergency ordinance. "As you can see," I said, pointing, "my cabin lies clearly outside the HOA boundary in the original filing. This digitally altered version, submitted 4 months ago, shows it mysteriously inside." Judge Hallberg leaned forward. "Do you have proof these boundaries were altered after the fact?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I have a statement from a member of the HOA board confirming that the digital map was edited without board-wide approval. I also have metadata from the county record system showing the last edit was submitted by Elkin's Law Group." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jerry stiffened beside Mark. I handed over a signed affidavit, anonymous, but admissible. The judge reviewed it silently for a moment before motioning me to continue. "And this," I said, holding up another document, "is the Wisconsin Area Freedom Act of 1983. It clearly states that no HOA may impose regulations on properties outside its original chartered boundaries. The law is specific, enforceable, and still in effect." Mark stood abruptly. "Your Honor, the Area Freedom Act is an outdated statute and has no bearing in modern HOA management. The emergency ordinance supersedes all." "No, it doesn't," I interrupted. "Because it was built on falsified documentation. And you knew it." Gasps from the crowd. Mark's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation." I met his gaze. "So is filing fraudulent documents to a county office." Judge Hallberg looked unimpressed. "Counselor, do you have a rebuttal? With supporting documentation?" Mark hesitated. We're acting in the interest of community safety." "Do you have legal authority to impose emergency jurisdiction on properties outside the HOA?" Silence. "I didn't think so," the judge said flatly. I called my first witness, Talia Zhang, who testified about the conservation designation of Timberpine Lake and how Jerry had tried to sidestep the restrictions. Then Marie Simmons, who brought in photocopies of Jerry's violation history and her obsessive campaign against former cabin owners. Finally, I handed the judge a printout of file metadata showing the original plat file name, and the new version submitted to the county, with timestamps. It was damning. And still, the room wasn't breathing until I called one last name. "Your Honor, I request to question Jerry Monroe directly." Mark objected, but Judge Hallberg allowed it. Jerry took the stand calm at first. Her voice clipped and cold. "Mrs. Monroe," I began. "Why did you submit an updated boundary map that included my property? There was confusion about the exact line." "Confusion? Or opportunity?" She shifted in her seat. "Do you recall sending me multiple violation letters before the storm? Filing complaints to the sheriff's office? I was upholding standards. Even though I was not, and am not, a member of your HOA?" Jerry's hands tightened on the witness box edge. "You painted your house lavender. It ruined the visual harmony." I stepped closer. "This isn't about paint, is it?" She didn't answer. "This is about control. About forcing out the last holdouts. About keeping your grip on a neighborhood you don't even legally own. I built that HOA." She snapped suddenly, her voice cracking. "It was the only place I ever felt in control." She stopped, realizing too late she'd said it out loud. The courtroom went still. I turned to the judge. "No further questions." After a long pause, Judge Hallberg straightened her posture. "This court finds in favor of the defendant, Evelyn Rhodes. The HOA's emergency jurisdiction is declared invalid. All enforcement actions against non-member properties are permanently enjoined. Furthermore, the matter of document fraud will be referred to the district attorney's office for further investigation." Jerry slumped in her seat. Mark paled. A ripple of quiet applause broke through the courtroom as I returned to my seat, binder in hand, finally, free. Within a month of the verdict, the ripple effects were everywhere. The county's legal team reviewed the original conservation designation Talia had helped unearth, confirming that Timberpine Lake was, in fact, a protected ecological zone, and had been since 1971. The proposed luxury resort plan? Dead on arrival. Any developer even whispering about concrete near the shoreline would now have to deal with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and a newly energized, watchful community. Jerry Monroe resigned in disgrace from the HOA. The district attorney opened a formal investigation into document tampering and misuse of public authority. Mark Elkins quietly shut down his firm 3 weeks later. In their place, the HOA elected a new board, smaller, volunteer-based, and transparent. Talia agreed to join as vice president under one condition. "We stop acting like an empire and start acting like neighbors." They did. Violations were retracted. Properties outside the HOA were formally exempted in writing. And for the first time in years, the community began to feel like an actual community again. As for me, I took a few weeks to rest, really rest. Then, one morning, I opened my laptop and began writing a guide called Rights of the Independent Homeowner: How to Stand Your Ground Against HOA Overreach. It started as therapy. It turned into a small movement. Neighbors from other lakes reached out. Retirees, veterans, single moms, all with stories that sounded too familiar. I sent out digital copies of my guide, free of charge. I never set out to become a symbol. I just wanted to keep my porch lavender. And now, on quiet evenings, I do just that. I sit out there with a cup of chamomile, the lake glittering under the setting sun, the soft purple of the wood glowing with warmth. No more notices. No more threats. Just peace. And Greg, somewhere in the breeze, finally smiling with me. If this story gave you hope or made you smile, tap subscribe. New stories every day. In the end, this wasn't just a story about paint colors or property lines. It was about boundaries, the kind we draw with ink, with laws, and with quiet resolve. Evelyn's journey reminds us that standing your ground doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes, it's the quiet filing of paperwork, the careful documenting of truth, and the unwavering belief that dignity is worth protecting. We live in a world where small people in positions of power often try to control others through fear, intimidation, and manipulation. But the law, when understood and used wisely, can still be a shield for the everyday person. This story teaches us to know our rights, to value community over control, and to never underestimate the strength of one determined individual backed by truth. Whether you're fighting a corrupt HOA, an unfair policy, or just trying to reclaim peace in your life, remember Evelyn's lavender porch, a symbol that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to stand. And sometimes, that's more than enough to change everything.